Hey, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Before we get into this week's podcast, I just want to acknowledge some sad news. Last night, on the 14th of May, former mayor of Brampton, Peter Robertson, passed away. Peter Robertson, for those who've been around for a while, you may remember him, was the mayor of Brampton through the 90s. He first was elected to council in the late 70s. He was one of our first regional councillors for the Castlemore area back in 1979. Served on council for about a decade, and then became mayor in 1991 through 2000. So through a huge period of Brampton's growth, really was the spearhead for a lot of that change. Had a very close relationship with the Brampton Board of Trade, and it was remembered very fondly by those of his generation, both from the political sphere, but also those in the business sphere. My understanding was that he had a long battle and succumbed yesterday, was surrounded and by those who was close to him. His children were all able to come and spend time with him. And we offer our condolences to the family of Peter Robertson. We will spend time in future podcasts talking a little bit about Mr. Robertson and other notables here in our community as we wish to connect our current Brampton to its history. But today wanted to start off by acknowledging this sad moment and wishing our condolences to those who are close to him. Thank you. Welcome to the Never Board of Trade podcast. I think this is episode 6 we're on now.
Yep.
So this is our bi-weekly conversation around what's happening in Brampton as you and I try to make sense of what's going on in our community and take big ideas and boil them down to what they mean for Brampton.
Yeah.
So lots of fun stuff to talk about this week. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, we've got a new development. We officially have a sponsor.
Yeah.
And want to thank the Brampton Honey Badgers for supporting this great work. So, hence, I gave the preamble of what this podcast is about to acknowledge that facilitating that distillation of ideas and conversation about Brampton. We're always looking for others to help with that leadership, and we appreciate the Brampton Honey Badgers stepping up and doing so. So thank you to them. So since the last time we connected, there's been some fun stuff's happened. We last talked about the election wrapping up, the results of the election, but recognizing that there wasn't a lot we could do in terms of our advocacy or engagement until we knew who cabinet was going to be, who was going to represent the various files, and where Brampton was going to sit in all of this. So we've had some fun announcements. Tell me, what do you think? We got some great stuff happen this week, I think.
Totally, yeah. No, I'm interested to kind of examine what this means about this government and what direction Carney is taking this government. I mean, he shrunk the size of cabinet, we could say, compared to the Trudeau years. There are 28 ministers and then 10 secretaries of state, which we'll talk about. There are 3 members of cabinet from Brampton, which is exciting. Something that we haven't really seen in a little while. I think part of that, and we've talked about this, but I think part of that decision making is the electoral result in Brampton, and it was razor thin for the Liberals here. They did win 5 out of 6 seats, but one of those ridings, Brampton Centre, was determined, the day after. And in Brampton West, I mean, they're our lone member of cabinet, Kamal Khera, lost her seat to the Conservative candidates, Amarjeet Gill. So I do think this government recognizes that Brampton's not a foregone conclusion for the Liberals, and therefore they rewarded our community with 3 cabinet positions. Interesting cabinet positions, I'll say. We have Shafkat Ali, who's the member for Brampton Chinguacousy Park. He is now the president of the Treasury Board. We have a friend of the Board of Trade, Maninder Sidhu, who has been very responsive to some of the our discussions around trade, and because of his previous position as parliamentary secretary.
He was parliamentary secretary on international trade in the past. That's correct.
So now he is a minister of international trade, which is fitting. And then we have this interesting new position called Secretary of State for Combating Crime. And that's Ruby Sahota. And that's a particularly interesting position because, as we've come to learn, public safety and crime had played a bigger part in the determination of this election than you and I probably might have anticipated, or at least me. And so we're seeing an indication that this government is prioritizing public safety with this position.
Just stepping away from Vijay's dulcet tones to share once more that we're really pleased that today's podcast has been sponsored by the Brampton Honey Badgers. Their season starts very shortly on May 25th. Make sure to get your season's tickets and support our local basketball team. Thank you so much. I'm really curious of the three. That's the one I'm most curious about because it's the one that feels like it's really a reaction to the election. And I'm sure those in the Liberal Party would characterize it as a response.
Yeah.
And hearing the voices of Canadians and all the good stuff that comes along with it, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. But this has not been an issue that the previous Liberal governments or even during the election was raised. This idea of being tough on crime. But Prime Minister Carney has really tried to, post-election, really been strong in his statements around this. But it really feels like it's a direct reaction to the fact that the Conservatives have tried to own this topic, and it's been, I think, a theme through this period of the election. From Prime Minister Carney first becoming elected as Prime Minister within the party up until the election itself, of basically taking away the Conservatives' talking points. They took away the carbon tax as a talking point. The Liberal Party took away Trudeau as a talking point. And what were they left with? They were left with affordability and crime. And it seems like this is just one more move to take away a talking point from the Conservative Party to say, you think you're tough on crime? We're going to be tough on crime.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to see what the teeth of that department looks like, because it's not been something that the Liberal government typically has focused on in a direct way. But to make this a high profile set of ridings, to make a parliamentary secretary who's responsible for this specific file is, I think, is a real statement. But I'm really curious as what's behind that statement.
Yeah, I'm curious as well. I'm curious what will they do?
Yeah.
In a real sense, because I think we've heard from both the federal Conservative Party during the campaign and also even the provincial Progressive Conservatives in Ontario that it was really the federal government, the Trudeau led government that led to some of the frustrations around bail and things like that, and crime more generally. And then we saw from the Conservatives a desire to contravene charter rights in some cases to make some changes in this regard. I'm very curious what the Carney government is prioritizing on this file in particular. Whenever we talk about things like bail and crime, I feel like I need to always preface by saying we live in a system where everyone is innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And, I do think some of the conversation around this topic is a little bit troubling at times. So all I can really hope for is measured policy making in this area.
I hope so too. I mean, the reality is if you really want to have policies that address crime, you have to be going further upstream.
Yeah.
Crime is about poverty. It's about opportunity.
Exactly.
It's about, much larger systemic issues in society that leave people in desperate situations.
Totally.
Is there a criminal element in people who are bad and will always do bad? Of course. But I think every statistic will bear out that is a very, very small percentage of individuals.
Yeah.
And that the rate of, and although there's a perception that crime is on the rise, in some communities like Brampton, the percentage of crime being committed relative to the percentage of growth of population is actually per capita, crime is going down. Okay. We just live in a time right now where I think crime is more easily publicized and made aware of, and that politicians, who are, or those who are looking to, make a point, can very easily draw attention to some specific incidents. Yeah. But overall, crime is on the decline. Violent crime is on the decline, and yet here we are doing, a parliamentary secretary responsible for this. Again, it feels very reactive to me, and it feels like it's a bit of a, a bit of a move to try to mollify a community rather than necessarily make impact. I'm curious what they'll do to make impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there is an uncomfortable association between a rise in crime, let's say, or perceived rise in crime, perceptions of safety, and immigration in particular. So yeah, to your point, I absolutely agree. This is a socioeconomic problem, and we need to strengthen our institutions and all these things. So yeah, let's see what comes out of it. But I'm curious from your perspective. We talked a little bit about Brampton, but what are your reactions to the cabinet as a whole? I mean, even for the folks outside of Brampton, we have some interesting decisions about some old faces, some new faces. What's your reaction?
I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on, and I think it may be a little bit too early to know. But I certainly, it's difficult to understand exactly where the Prime Minister is taking this. I think some things like this, the creation of this crime role, for instance, I think are an indication that he's trying to distinguish his government from his predecessors. One of the criticisms of the Trudeau government was that there was a focus. It was characterized as wokeism, but there was a focus on issues that were not necessarily those kitchen table issues that Canadians that mattered most to Canadians, and that there was a focus on issues of social justice and so forth at the expense of other things. And I'll let others litigate that piece, but that was certainly the criticism that was levied. And I think one of the moves, or among the reasons that we see this cabinet shift that we're having, is to address that piece. I think creations of roles like the crime role, loosening of some of the individuals who are part of that previous Trudeau government, I think is really just trying to make a declarative statement that this is as you should. Actually, you did a great job of characterizing it. This was a change election. And yet we ended up with the same party in charge. So how do they demonstrate change? And I think this is how they're trying to demonstrate change is a push more to the center and away from the left. And I think acknowledging issues such as crime and others is a way of doing so. Jettisoning some of the old Trudeau guard is a way of declaring that as well. So I think that's. So if you're doing sort of broad strokes around some of these cabinet appointments, I think part of it is just showing this is a new way of doing things. I think the Secretary of State role, again, is just demonstrating a different way of doing things, just to try to show that change has in fact happened. Even if a lot of the people who are still representing our community are the same people from the same party. So how else do you demonstrate that change? The part I'm trying to figure out is that the thinking would be that, and Prime Minister Carney has said as much, is that he wants I can't remember the exact quoting, but that he wants the ministers to be making the decisions. That the PMO is not going to be the central, authority, is not going to be micromanaging things. Again, one of the criticisms that was levied of the Trudeau government. But it's been interesting to me to see that since the naming of that new cabinet, a lot of folks who were the more outspoken folks in the previous regime, like Nate Erskine-Smith, have been left out in the dark. And he was Nate was a really effective minister, an effective minister, but more importantly, a really outspoken voice in the Liberal Party, but potentially a dissenting voice at times. He speaks his mind, and he speaks on the record all the time. And pushed to the side. In as much as he talked about, I want the ministers to speak their mind and make the decisions. I'm not going to micromanage things. It was interesting to me that no one has spoken since those appointments except the Prime Minister. After those announcements were made, when he went down to visit President Trump, only he spoke. So in as much as the conversation has been about how he wants a less centralized cabinet, it hasn't been demonstrated in behavior yet. It looks like anyone who is a potential dissenting voice has been left out. He's certainly rewarded some of the folks who have his early supporters as part of his nomination campaign, have cabinet positions, and he himself has been doing all the talking. So I'm some mixed messages here.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Interesting take, because I think, I don't know if this is deliberate or not, but I see some comparisons to Chrétien a little bit, in the sense that he said that he wants to give ministers an outsized level of autonomy, let's say, in determining their portfolios. But and also this utilization of the Secretary of State. Could be wrong, but I believe Chrétien is the one who created this term in the Canadian context. And so we're, and also the disposition of Prime Minister Carney is one of a red Tory or progressive conservative. Even though he is a liberal, he's sort of governing from a right of center sort of position, which is a lot like Chrétien consensus and whatnot. So that's very interesting. But that being said, maybe it is the veneer of Chrétien, and maybe that we're seeing the level of centralization in the PMO that we saw with both Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper as well. Time will tell. But you mentioned Erskine-Smith. I was really disappointed with that. I'll be honest with you. I assumed that he was going to be the one in that Minister of Housing portfolio. As you mentioned, I mean, I think he was a very effective minister in the short time that he was minister. He made the announcement in Brampton around the LRT.
He's beloved here.
Absolutely. And in media interviews, he's talked about the need to have the government kind of return to this role of providing social and co-op housing. The Minister of Housing is now Gregor Robertson, who's former mayor of Vancouver. An interesting choice, I think. On one hand, you could say, he has a decade of municipal experience, and this is a municipal issue, housing. On the other hand, you could point to his record and the fact that house prices in Vancouver have effectively doubled during his tenure, and that development charges have increased by 100+%. And even in some of the interviews that he has done, he's talked about things like developers make too much money, and he's shown support for DCs and things like that. And this one really made its rounds on social media, but he said that house prices do not need to come down in order to achieve affordable housing.
Yeah.
Mike Moffat actually put together a bit of an article examining that, and technically he is true. House prices don't have to come down
eventually.
Yeah,
but that eventually is
like 20 years from
there.
now,
You go.
Right? Yeah, so, and wages have
and that's
to rise
assuming nothing else changes along the way. Yeah, zero inflation and all those things along the way.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We'll see how that goes. But
that's a real head scratcher to me. That and you touched on the justification one could make.
Yeah.
The experience at the municipal level, because affordable housing fundamentally has to be activated. Any policy has to be activated at that municipal level.
Yeah.
So I can see how on paper, by resume, this individual would be the appropriate one. But by record, absolutely atrocious. Yeah. All the things you comment about the cost of living in Vancouver, not just within Canada, it's one of the most expensive cities in the world, and constantly increasing. But also, ground zero for those experiencing homelessness within Canada.
Yeah.
The encampments there are well publicized. But not a great record of supporting those individuals who are in those precarious positions either.
Yeah.
Those tent cities exist, but there's not been a lot of wraparound support. There's not been a lot of action taken in Vancouver to help those individuals transition into other forms of housing, or to provide them with other resources to support them. So to me, this is like, I see an individual who fundamentally does not understand the connection between how housing is developed and affordability, as you pointed out, but also doesn't seem to have a basic empathy and compassion for those who are left out of market housing. So to me, I'm really worried about where this takes it, because the one thing we can all agree on, and during the election, pretty much the only thing that both the Conservatives and the Liberals agreed on, was that housing affordability is a crisis and needs to be addressed. And I don't know that we've got the right person in charge.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I'm hoping that this might be his redemption arc in some ways. But
you're a generous individual.
Yeah, that's right. I'm curious. What are your thoughts on Champagne keeping his finance portfolio?
I'm not surprised by it ultimately, because I just didn't see who else within was going to be the right person to take the reins on that.
I mean, there was some talk about Tim Hodgson, his banker friend.
Yeah, I did hear that as well. But to me, I think Champagne's not had the role for very long.
Yeah.
I think it gives, and I suspect this piece too. I think Prime Minister Carney is going to be very hands-on with this particular file. Like this is his area of expertise.
Yeah.
I think having a little bit of trust there, having someone who's got some reps in,
For sure.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And quite frankly, having a high-ranking minister in Champagne, I think is not just about the finance portfolio. Quite frankly, I think it's about the French piece.
Oh yeah.
Having someone from Quebec who is bilingual, and shores up a weakness that the Prime Minister has. I think there's a little bit of a tactical piece to it there too. I don't think he's, like I said, I don't think there was anyone who was clearly the better. So I don't think it was a poor decision. I do think it had more to do with just the finance file. I think it had to do with something about, how does a Liberal Party ensure that they have strength in Quebec? Having a high-ranking minister who is bilingual, who's the Prime Minister's right hand on a file that the Prime Minister is going to be very, very active on, particularly given the trade situation right now.
Totally.
To me, I think it has a lot more political capital than about what it is about actually managing that ministry.
You know what? That's a really good point. And Champagne, in addition to the French, has deep political experience, something that Carney doesn't have. And that finance role, I think we've come to learn, mainly with the ways that Morneau's financial experience didn't exactly help him in that position. The Minister of Finance is a deeply political role rather than a subject matter expert in many ways. But yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah.
What do
So
you think? You asked
yeah.
the questions. I wonder if you have a perspective there as
No,
well.
I think I agree with you. I think it's a statement about and more generally, I mean, we see Sean Fraser in Justice,
Yeah,
and Chrystia Freeland has internal trade, I believe. Melanie
that's right.
Jolie has industry. Um, Anita Anand is foreign affairs. So
Yeah,
we see some familiar
yeah,
faces. I think there's been some criticism that Carney didn't shake things up, but those are probably the most, I don't want to say qualified, but credentialed.
yeah.
The most credentialed to be in the front bench, so to speak, right?
I don't understand where the criticism
Yeah,
came from. I mean, the criticism could be levied if other MPs were elected who had
yeah,
more experience or who
yeah,
had better credentials.
yes,
I understand the optics of it. It feels
yeah,
like a reshuffle of a lot of the same faces, but those are our most experienced politicians in Canada.
yeah,
They are the people who've had the most reps in. They
yes,
are the people who understand those files,
yeah,
and to keep them in positions of strength,
yeah,
to me makes complete sense.
yeah,
I don't think satisfying the desire for again, it's a change
yeah, yeah,
election. You have to
yeah,
find ways to demonstrate change. This wasn't the place to
yeah,
demonstrate change at the risk of having an inexperienced minister
yeah,
running a file. Anita Nunn, for
yeah,
instance, like that is a critical file right now
yeah,
in terms of where Canada is on the global stage, where Canada is in its relationship with the United States.
yeah,
We need someone like her who is outspoken,
mm,
clearly has a moral compass,
yeah,
and does not back down from people.
yeah.
And
And who
so
was a star during COVID, right? Yeah,
exactly. Who else would you send if
yeah,
not her? So
yeah.
to me, it makes complete sense. Even if she is a face we've seen before, I think it's the right face.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Yeah. And actually, on that point, there are some with the secretaries of state and some of these new ministerial portfolios. A minister of AI,
Yeah.
Evan Solomon,
Yeah.
right? I wonder how they'll overlap because we have foreign affairs, and then we have, I believe it's LeBlanc. I could be wrong. LeBlanc or McGinn? No, LeBlanc has the U.S. relationship
That's correct. Yeah.
portfolio as well. There's internal trade, but there's also Secretary of State of One Economy or something there's a lot of
Yeah.
overlaps,
There's a
right?
lot of, and then Jolie has industry, which has
Yeah.
overlaps with these pieces as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then more generally, so you talked about demonstrating change.
Yeah.
Mark Carney, of course, is the change.
Yeah.
Now, I think my personal view is that a prime minister, a good, effective leader in Canada, has to be good at coalition building, has to be good at maintaining and advancing relationships with premiers and
Hmm.
so on and so forth. I think if Carney is the subject matter expert on the economy, he is going to lean on his cabinet really to do some of the political work
Yeah.
here. So that's very interesting.
Just
Yeah.
talk about the change
Yeah.
piece just before we jump off this. I
Yeah.
think I just want to lean in on your knowledge of our parliamentary system here. Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about the Secretary of State role,
Yeah.
because this is something that was a little bit new. I'll admit myself, I had to look it up
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's a term I only associate with U.S. politics.
Yeah.
And I
Fair.
did not have a frame of reference for what it meant that we had these secretaries of state. So,
Yeah.
what does it mean broadly, and what do you think it means in the context of the decisions that were made on earlier this week on Tuesday?
Yeah, it's a term that has been used in Canadian politics before. I don't. I think we haven't used that term for maybe 30 years.
Mhm.
I could be wrong, but again, as I mentioned, I think this really was facilitated by John Chrétien
Mhm.
as a term to describe a junior minister or a minister that might not necessarily be required for ongoing cabinet engagement, but might be brought in for a specific tactical solutioning around specific problems. And so I think this term has changed a little bit. Some call them ministers of state. I believe Paul Martin utilized the term minister of state. There's a junior minister. I think depending, a parliamentary secretary isn't the same thing, but
Yeah.
depending on the year, there are certain powers and responsibilities that a parliamentary secretary has that might overlap with the Secretary of State.
Right.
But as we see from some of these files, combating crime, we see Rechi Valdez, the Secretary of State of Small Business.
Yeah.
This is a signal that Prime Minister Carney feels that there are certain priorities that require an entire ministry.
Yeah.
But there are specific issues that maybe we don't need to be spending the entire bandwidth of cabinet or caucus to address. But we do need someone who is focused on a very specific issue that could help shape some policy around a specific issue. So I think it's an interesting choice. I think secretaries of state are sort of a cheeky way to kind of shrink the size of cabinet. I mean, a cabinet with Prime Minister Carney is 29.
Yeah.
But you add the 10 ministers and it's closer to 40, or secretaries of state and it's closer to 40. But yeah, an interesting choice. And I'll also say that Prime Minister Carney is getting a lot of credit for having a small cabinet. I don't think he has the smallest cabinet. I think Stephen Harper, had something in the mid-20s or so. But it's an interesting choice, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to sort of make some sense of it too. So appreciate the little bit background there. And again, to me, this just sort of reaffirms that perspective of, all things are equal parts governance and politics.
Yeah.
Right. So why were these positions created? Why were these particular individuals put in those roles?
Yeah.
Let's use that crime one again. We can talk about, the small business piece,
Yeah.
but I think a number of these roles were created in part to satisfy governance priorities. To your point, change needs to happen. Policies need to be implemented. Stakeholders need to be engaged, and so forth. But I do think a lot of it is also about the politics of it. And politics by nature is a bit of theater. And I think it's a way of for the PMO to say to Canadians, we heard you. And these issues are important to us as well.
Yeah.
And again, we'll see how effective these individuals are in their roles. In some cases, I have a couple head scratchers because again, it sort of feels like jurisdiction that's a little bit outside of what the federal government would prioritize. Yeah. But nevertheless, I think what this is about is really trying to send a message to Canadians that the issues that were raised in the election, even if they weren't the ones that the Liberals ran on, are now the ones that the Liberals are going to govern on.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a lot of these sort of optical appointments came from as well. And hopefully they become effective appointments.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, on that note, it's noticeable that there is a lack of Western sort of representation in cabinet. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think about the Western alienation?
I was surprised in general about that one. Yeah, 100%. Because I thought this was the brewing crisis of the moment. And it's certainly going to be among the first things I think that the Prime Minister is going to have to deal with when Parliament resumes is going to have to be, how do we settle down and start building bridges with Western Canada again? We have clearly being led by the Premier with a high degree of plausible deniability that she's clinging to, a referendum brewing on, whether Alberta wishes to secede from Canada, which, there's 1,000 reasons why it's a bad idea. And there's, 10,000 reasons why they can't, quite frankly. This is a very, this is all about, again, the theater of it all. But nevertheless, you can't ignore it. Just because it's the results of a referendum are not binding, they're not going to be acted on. It's just a statement of opinion. It doesn't threaten, Canada's unity in any tangible or legal sense of the word. It nevertheless has an impact on the culture and the feeling of Canadians, and therefore has to be addressed. And the fact that there weren't some strategic appointments or strategic outreach to build some bridges between Ottawa and Alberta really surprised me. I would have thought for sure that we would have seen more, but it also speaks to, quite frankly, that the Liberal Party did not pick up a lot of seats in Alberta and did not have perhaps the MP depth to make some of these cabinet appointments that they needed. So I can see it from both sides that there wasn't, if you look at like who the star MPs are and some of the places where they needed to shore up, not a lot of those folks came from Alberta. But at the same time, they have to figure out a way, I think, to come up with some strategy to bring Alberta back into the fold.
And Prime Minister Carney does have experience with independence movements, Scottish independence,
absolutely.
Right? When he was the governor of the Bank of England.
I hadn't thought about it that way. I hadn't thought about it that way. He has seen this before.
They're at 170 seats.
With I think 3 ridings still in recount. Windsor, I know, is one. I think Milton is still one, and there's a third one out there as well. So it is possible that they may get to a majority before all this is done. So we'll see what happens.
Do you think any, should things stay the same, Do you think any floor crossing might be happening?
Oh, I think it's
Yeah.
certainly in play. I think it's just a question of where the NDP finds themselves
Yeah.
from a leadership perspective
Yeah.
themselves. But if I'm an NDP MP right now,
Yeah.
I would want to stay where I am. I was elected on that platform, but if it turns out, at some point you're gonna have to make a decision about how effective you can be
Yeah.
as an MP representing your community.
Yeah.
And if there isn't strong leadership from the NDP, if there isn't a pathway back from the exile that they find themselves in now
Mhm.
to a place where they can be, have party status, have resources, have a vision that they can bring to Canadians nationally once again. If I'm one of those MPs, at some point I'd be thinking, well, I can stick to my principles and be here but not be effective,
Yeah.
or I can walk across the floor
Yeah.
and have a lot more opportunity to help my
Totally.
community.
Totally.
I think it's just a question of playing that out and
Yeah.
seeing where the NDP finds themselves. But I
Totally.
wouldn't be surprised if we start to see it. Absolutely.
Yeah. What about that riding that where the Liberal candidate won by one vote in Quebec?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, if ever there was a, I love when stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
Because you need those examples
Yeah.
of every vote counts.
Yes.
So I hope people remember this
Yeah.
whenever there's 2 years from now, 18 months from now, 4 years from now, whenever we have that next federal election.
Yeah.
I very much hope that story has some like apocryphal value,
Yeah.
and we cite it again, because you need a few of those, because when elections are landslides, you don't get that sense that a vote matters. Having these are important reminders. So maybe wrap up this topic, bringing it back to Brampton. Then is we had a couple of very close contests here. I believe, in as much as I'm surprised that Alberta isn't getting more love, perhaps it's we're going to cut our losses. It's a sunk cost. Let's double down on where we can perhaps shore up Liberal strength, and that is in the 905. And we got a lot of ministerial appointments in Peel Region. We got 3 in Brampton. The irony is that you and I have started some conversations and outreach to our new MPs.
Yes.
We had one by our office on, was it Monday? Monday.
Yeah.
And we got into it, and one of the topics that was raised was, I don't mean in an aggressive way, just a lot of topics. And one of the topics that was raised was the fact that it felt to us that that Brampton was viewed as a vote bank and not necessarily a place where decisions were made. All parties spend a lot of money chasing votes here in the 905. In Brampton specifically, we've talked at length about the why, but we were never rewarded with ministerial appointments. And Kamala Kara, but she was in that caretaker government, and had a short stint. Maninder Sidhu had the opportunity to serve as a parliamentary secretary, but we never had a ministerial role here. And now to be rewarded with 3 members of cabinet, 1 as a minister, really feels like they're doubling down and saying, okay, well, maybe the thinking is Alberta's lost, but how can we really make sure we're strong here? And so we've got a number of appointments in Brampton. What does that mean for you and I? What does that mean for the Board of Trade in terms of the things that we're trying to advance?
Well, I think it's a very exciting opportunity, because as we see in the case of the provincial government, Brampton has a lot of political capital.
Yeah.
And to his credit, the Premier is very responsive to Brampton needs, and we have, when it comes to Riverwalk and the LRT and a few other big projects, the province has been listening. So I'm hoping and anticipating that there's a similar sort of relationship that's forming with the federal government with respect to some of our needs. Yeah,
I'm really excited.
Yeah.
I do think this is an opportunity for civic institutions and leadership organizations like ours and many of our colleagues
for sure
to really press for the needs of this community in a way that we've never been able to before. Because we didn't have the ear of MPs nearly as closely, and I don't think we've ever had the needs of our community so acutely acknowledged. And the slipping traction that party's had in this community so clearly acknowledged. That's what this was to me. This is an acknowledgement that they realize they almost lost Brampton. And had they lost Brampton, they may have lost the election. Or the 905, they would have lost the election. And so to me, this is an amazing opportunity for us now to meet and work with our other stakeholders to say, okay, on these particular files, but more importantly, on Brampton priorities on the whole, in the main, how can we bring these forward now? We have individuals in Parliament who have the ear of the Prime Minister, who owe their seats to Brampton.
Yes.
And I think we have to make sure that they're reminded of that in a gentle way, not in a threatening way, but they serve at the will of the people of Brampton.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that that's hammered home consistently, and our priorities are well articulated.
Yeah.
And I do think this is where it's lovely that we have a mixed caucus here.
Yeah.
Because in addition to us and organizations like us being able to raise that voice, we now have an MP who is not a Liberal in Brampton, who no doubt will be raising many of those same issues around accountability as well. I'm not saying which party's in the right, but having a mix allows for the conversation around accountability to be there. It's not we're not just going to get fluffed off because a block of any party said just shoot us away. So I'm quite excited to where we find ourselves right now. A mixed caucus and a bunch of ministers. This is really, really great for Brampton.
Our advocacy, depending on who's listening, can either be let's move the government to listen, or let's encourage opposition to do some of our bidding and to advance some of these ideas. So it's an exciting position.
I'm super psyched.
Yeah.
I'm super psyched for this. So on topic of local, as we're going down the funnel, there's been some stuff on the provincial side. You attended OCC's Advocacy Day earlier this week. So this was the OCC puts together, Ontario Chamber of Commerce, brings together chambers from across the province to engage with provincial leadership at Queen's Park. It's an opportunity typically to have meetings in small groups with ministers to raise particular issues. I think a number of issues were cited, but I think the snap election and a bunch of things that happened earlier this spring meant there was a slightly different format. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit for those who are listening about what you got to see and what you think that means for Brampton in terms of some of the conversations you were able to listen in on.
On Tuesday, the OCC, as you mentioned, put together this great day at Queen's Park. We started with a breakfast reception. We heard from all the major party leaders, well, except for the Premier, of course. He was attending to the news coming out of Honda. We heard from Marit Stiles, the leader of the official opposition. We heard from Bonnie Crombie, who's the leader of the Liberal Party. Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party. And then we heard from on the Premier's behalf, Minister Bethan Falvey as well. Ultimately it was a good day. We started our day at Queen's Park, and then we attended question period. It sort of reminded me of a field trip to Queen's Park. It was quite nice. It was interesting actually to see that the dynamic of how opposition and government sort of. It's sort of this maybe romantic view of how, I mean, it was theatrical nonetheless, but it was interesting to see that dynamic play out of similar priorities, but where's the emphasis, right? And then after that, we went to the Mars building, Mars Discovery District, and there were a number of panels with ministers as well, Minister Sarkaria, Minister Surma, Kinga Surma, Lecce, Minister Lecce, and a few others who really spoke about the where the government is headed in terms of their priorities, and in particular in light of Budget Day, which is today as we're recording this on Thursday, just reiterating some of these priorities. So in terms of Brampton, I think as I mentioned earlier, the government is prioritizing some of the key infrastructure projects that are important to us. And they're really emphasizing the need to cut red tape, speed up development, speed up construction, and really bring some of these projects. And actually, Minister Sarkaria said it perfectly. He said, some of the reasons why these projects, didn't come to fruition before is because politicians, thought in 4-year cycles, and there's a real desire for this government to think about 30 years from now and think about legacy in that way. But that doesn't mean, shovels can get in the ground now, even if it's not completed in 4 years. That's okay.
That is radical thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
from a politician. I've never heard a politician say that. That's amazing.
Yeah. So anyway,
that's a guy who's really confident that he's going to get reelected. Maybe.
Right. Exactly.
But that's really refreshing because my concern was that so many of the big issues that we talk about day in day out, and I'm not even talking about Board of Trade priorities. I'm just talking like healthcare in particular, is something that really we all can agree needs real reform, needs real change. And among the reasons I think, we've never really seen that reform and change is because politicians think in 4-year cycles, and no one wants to start a project for which they're not going to get the credit at the end. And and some of these big ideas and these big seismic shifts are going to be those types of things where people are just going to have to say, I'm going to get this ball rolling, and I may not be here at the end of the journey, and someone's going to get the credit or cut the ribbon or be in the photo, and that's okay. If we actually have politicians who are thinking on that level, that's and that's not just talk, but actual action. That is to the benefit. I don't care what your party is. That's to the benefit of anyone in this province. Absolutely. If you have a province, a government that's thinking in a longer term cycle. Oh, that's great.
Totally.
And then the budgets today.
Yep.
Anything that you're excited or looking forward to seeing? I've gotten little snippets here and there. I was at an event last night that Minister Fideli was at. It was life sciences and health tech oriented. He without saying numbers, obviously, he made a lot of hints and dropped a lot of hints that competitiveness in the healthcare and life science sector was going to be a priority in the budget. And look for some big numbers in there. Definitely numbers with B's on them. We're going to be in the budget to help bring up the competitiveness of the life science and R&D sectors in Ontario. So I'm curious to see what manifests itself there, and anything that you're going to be keen to see. I share that because obviously there's a big med tech push within Brampton to develop that sector here for us in our community. Anything that you'll be looking for later today?
Well, that's fascinating. First of all, I also am anticipating some big ticket items and big spending. I think the tariff situation has created this permission to spend boldly, and there will probably be some tariff support of some sort. I'd be surprised if there wasn't, some incentive or support to folks like Honda or one of these.
I think the EV piece is going to be interesting. Between Stellantis and Honda, we've had like two major blows to the automotive sector in Ontario in the last 2 months. I think whatever that EV strategy piece is to try to attract and encourage those companies to. And I think it's worth noting, neither company has said they're divesting from Ontario. They've just pushed back their timelines.
Yes, exactly.
So to double down or to go back to original timelines, I think will be a priority for the government. Sorry, I didn't speak over you, but I agree. This EV thing is a huge piece because the whole economy here is based around that.
Exactly, and tens of billions of dollars have went into the EV supply chain as well. I'm anticipating something around either the Ring of Fire or mining. Minister Lecce obviously took on this additional portfolio of energy and mines. Previously, he was just energy, and he was kind of making some overtures around that as well. And I do think mining. He's a talented orator and politician.
He's good.
You don't place him in a portfolio without a reason. So something along those lines. And then we saw earlier in the week a bill being introduced around housing. And I do think housing is obviously top of mind for every level of government right now. I thought, just as a quick aside, decent legislation, decent bill, speaks to a ton of our priorities with respect to DC deferral, like development charge deferrals and exemptions and things like that. And I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. There are some questions, of course, around things like the provincial building code being the de facto building code for across municipalities. What happens to things like the Toronto Green Standard for green builds and things like that? I also think some more, let's say, aggression on the affordable housing front is necessary from both provincial and federal governments. So.
Do you think we're going to see that? Do you think we're going to see flexibility and a broadening of the definition of the types of housing that are going to be prioritized by government and policy?
It's tough to say. So
I'm happy to hear all the announcements we're hearing. I'm here, and I albeit a very surface reading of the bill, but it seems like it's really focused still on incentivizing condos and market housing. And good to see that there's, I think, some support for or acknowledgement that intensification needs to happen. But what I haven't seen, again, surface reading, opening up for other paths for affordability.
I agree. I do think maybe there might be some stuff around purpose-built rentals or something like that. But you're right. I think a lot of the focus, both provincially and municipally, frankly, has been around market housing and condo development. And I think what I will say, I know we kind of criticized the new federal minister of housing. He has talked about the need for social and cooperative housing having the federal government get back into the business of that.
housing. Yeah.
So I do anticipate some leadership from the federal government in this area, and I'm hoping, and I'm hoping that there's a recognition that the provinces, or at least in Ontario, the province is doing a fine job of trying to engender private investment. Where they can step in is in the below market echelon. Yeah,
that'd be great to see. That'd be great to see. And then just as maybe a final piece there, because we're just from a time perspective, you did attend City Council this week as well, and I think you said some of that housing conversation did come up in the council conversation. And just maybe to wrap it up on what do you think that means locally? I think you said there was some DC conversation. Seems like it might be on the table for our council.
Yeah, I don't want to speak out of turn. I mean, but I will say the planning department, the city more broadly, is very receptive to our advocacy around residential DCs and following the example of Mississauga and Vaughan and Burlington in deferring but also discounting DCs in certain areas. I think there's a lot of discussion around what is called the MTSA, the major transit station areas. This was interesting because at the council meeting. We saw in the municipal context, we see the implication of some of these big policy ideas at the provincial and the federal level. Food trucks, as an example, can they operate within a MTSA?
Yeah.
Right. And this is something that nobody anticipated when they came up with this policy. Right. But there was a delegation about this. Right. Of course, we've talked at length about the secondary dwellings and the bylaw enforcement around illegal basements, and so the municipality has to deal with some of the fallout from some of this, these big ideas, and I guess my concluding thought is, I hope there's a recognition that there's a real cost to some of these problems, and that municipalities are supported.
That's great. No, I'm happy to hear that there is conversation happening at the municipal level here, like within Brampton. I think we're overdue for that discussion. And let's be hopeful that there's space for that to start to occur within the legislation that happens. I think this is, to your point, this is where our advocacy has to continue. I think you've done a great job over the past couple of months of engaging some of the folks from our development community and others who are just experts in the topic to help really frame up what some priorities could be and some of the changes that would actually make a practical difference. And I think maybe this is for a future podcast, but really diving into what are the mechanisms and levers that are available. You did a great job with our Moving the Needle event of like identifying some of those pieces, but I think for our listeners, there's a lot more we could talk about here.
Totally.
And a lot of attention is paid to DCs, for instance, but we've learned from our conversations with our developer members and others we've spoken to that that's a very, very small piece of the overall economic puzzle. And there's a lot of them have shared with us models that even if the DCs went down almost to zero, or we defer the DCs or whatever mechanisms we look at, it would still have almost no tangible impact on the overall affordability of a house or a housing unit.
Absolutely.
Unless we're able to do other things alongside it. And perhaps a future podcast for us to do is just one really diving into this issue, because I think there's a lot to unpack there. And as it becomes more of a priority, both federally and provincially, I think it matters that everyone really understands what it is that's being talked about and what are the specifics that we should be asking for in order to actually make it effective.
Yeah, there are things like zoning and cost
of the cost of labor.
Exactly. And cost of goods. No, it's gone up quite a bit. So I like that for a future podcast. So,
okay, there you go. Okay, so we talked about a bunch of stuff. We know what a future podcast. I think that feels like a good conversation.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Well, in that case, thanks everyone for listening. Really appreciate you. Thank you again to the Honey Badgers for supporting this conversation. And we'll look forward to talking to you again very soon. All right, take care.
Bye.